So we're in medieval Arabia. This is a time of great, great intellectual progress on a bunch of different fronts in the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate of Andalusia and Cordoba. And basically, Islam has gone through a radical change, not a radical change as in a super change, but it's gone through a radical process of formalization through jurisprudence, hadith, theology, kalam as they like to call it at that time, has become extremely developed as a discipline, and it's become quite rigorous. I mean, you have the towering figures like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Hanfi, all these
Imam Abu
different.
Hanifa, all
Yes,
these
all of
the
these.
star jurists who
Yeah,
everyone follows
yeah.
till this day.
So there's great intellectual vigor in this sphere. You have, of course, the Hellenistic falsafa, the philosophers, the guys who are deeply, deeply inspired by the Greek traditions of philosophy, the Aristotelian, the Neoplatonic schools. They're using a lot of those elements to help complement Islamic ideology, Islamic philosophy, and creating a new synthesis that tries to merge Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism, and Islam.
They're putting Greek metaphysics or they're using Greek metaphysics as a tool to interpret the Islamic God.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. These guys have a lot of क्या कहते हैं, intellectual merit in the sense of they have made some great accomplishments in the fields of medicine, in the fields of mathematics, in the field of optics, like Ibn Haytham. So, Al-Khwarizmi, of course. So this is a very, very vibrant group of people, extremely intelligent group of people, a little bit speculative at times and a little bit of syncretic, but not without some degree of intellectual merit in what they're doing.
Like, bro, look at the worst case.
Yeah.
Worst case. Are some ideas proven wrong later because you discover heliocentrism? Sure.
Yeah.
Are some ideas religiously heretical? Sure. Was there intellectual vigor in the time? No one can deny it.
Yeah,
Just that
yeah.
simple. They had motion.
Yeah, absolutely. They had motion, and there was a great deal of intellectual rigor they were also placing into the works they were doing.
They had
as we
motion,
will-
just like Ibn Sina's model of the universe.
Yes, they had motion. Yeah, and I mean Ibn Sina is very, very important in all of this. I think he would be the central figure in all of this, but we'll get to him in a bit. Within this entire extremely vibrant intellectual atmosphere, you also have the Sufis rising up, who come as a little bit of a reaction to the extremely structured theological, exoteric schools of Islam that are coming out at this time. Their main issue with a lot of what's happening and why it comes as a reaction a little bit is that they feel like the systemization, the exoteric creed was threatening to sever the relationship between the individual and God. And so sometimes they got a little bit too indulgent in some of their practice, but their goal, the goal of their school, their different schools, was to क्या कहते हैं, really, really invigorate and codify the value of mystical experience and direct experience
So,
of God itself,
to-
like
to-
direct tasting of God, as they used to like to say it.
To get into the mystic attitude and to kind of expand upon that,
Yeah.
One defining feature of a lot of the mystics of the time was the intimate knowing of God by an individual
Yeah.
on his deeply personal basis.
Yes.
So some people posited different routes. For example, one was there is a name of God imputed to you by who you are. Let me be more specific. Bayezid Bastami, who was a mystic, suggested basically that there was a system of divine allotment
Yeah.
where each of us would be allotted a name of God,
Yeah.
okay, by which we knew God and knew ourselves, but more importantly, that was the same thing. Now, what does that mean? For example, if you know God through the name of Him being the most merciful,
Yeah.
that corresponds with something intrinsic to your personality, which according to them, in the world of souls, was allotted to you before you were even born. So there is that element of predestination there.
Yes.
Right? And it is through that specific attribute of God, which some people even took to a theophanic extent, as in they would say that, oh, this manifests as an angel of mercy, and that angel of mercy for that individual is the face of God, and that is how he interfaces with God. So mystics took it to this very vague place, which would, by orthodox Islamic standards, be considered anywhere from unorthodox to heretical, right? But again, what's important to note is that they had some pretty sophisticated approaches behind this, which we'll, I think, expand on more over the course of the episode.
Yeah. So the crux of what we're going to talk about is, I would argue that the two most towering figures of this time, of this era, two out of the three, Al Ghazali and Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina representing the falsafa, the extremely wise men camp, and Al Ghazali really presenting himself as a sort of mujaddid, like a reformer, Mujaddid, a reformer type figure who manages to bridge a lot of these different schools into a synchristic and really legible in all package that the common man could also adopt, but it also had great deep levels of intellectual rigor applied to it as well.
And the kind of anti-philosophy or anti-intellectual allegations that Al Ghazali faces. And even though I don't agree with him on every single thing, I kind of found that I got to know him a little better when we were prepping for this episode. Because my impression earlier was that Ibn Sina is just on this completely Hellenistic bender, where he completely abandons the Islamic framework, which I don't think is entirely true.
I don't think that's true at all.
And with Al Ghazali as well, they make him out to be this
anti-intellectual, anti-rational,
unscientific, like unrational.
When he was in fact probably one of the most learned men of his time, even in terms of rationality and philosophy. Like, to put it in perspective, like, he wrote this book, or like a manuscript, which is the aims of the philosophers, which he really like summarizes what their entire canon was about so well that many centuries later,
it's almost a better case than the philosophers themselves.
He made a better case for the philosophers' aims than the philosophers themselves. So many centuries later, you had Europeans discover these manuscripts and think that, oh, this is like a validation of that entire framework, but it was actually a preparatory groundwork he does.
It was a generational steel man.
It was a generational steel man. Exactly, So he really comes to intimately understand those ideas, and before he attempts to pick them apart. So Al Ghazali is he's not an anti-rational type figure, but he is the most positive manifestation of a skeptic could be, where he's not skeptical as a naysayer, like I'm going to be skeptical about this to invalidate it, but his approach is skeptical in regards to what cannot be further deduced, that is what's real. So his skeptical approach is, in a way, kind of like, let me get to the meat and bones of any specific concept. What are its strengths and weaknesses, and how are they important? And this is the attitude he even has with the philosophers, where he's not like this type of person who just wants to take down the philosopher, but it's like, this is a lot of extra fat that we don't need, that cannot be proven, and this is the core of your work that has intellectual merit, and I'm going to accept it. So it's a type of positive skepticism. And it's the best way to describe his project.
To describe the general tone of the work of his that I read, he is passionately against certain heretical aspects of the philosophical movement, while at the same time completely unhesitant, unafraid to say XYZ argument from the philosophers has merit. And again, I think he embodies that long-standing ultimate principle of intellectual charity that people tend to ignore, is just intuitively an integral part of intellectual inquiry, but it is, in my opinion, central to Islam itself.
Yes, absolutely. And just to give a perspective of how deep his intellectual charity goes, where first and foremost, Al Ghazali is like, he's a lover of knowledge. Like, he has many existential crises in his life too, if I'm not mistaken, where he goes through these periods of having extreme doubt that make him like want to re-question everything, because he can't like get a grip of what the foundations for what he knows is. So he doesn't approach philosophy as a means of, let me read this to tear it apart, but a means of actually understanding it. And what is not, what cannot survive under the test of scrutiny should be discarded, which I think, is one of the most practical ways you can approach grand ideas and stuff. There's a lot of fluff in them, but the core elements of it, of any ideology, any philosophy, any concept, should be met with critical engagement. And he embodies
You know,
that.
just for a second, just an aside, on the idea of intellectual charity in Islam,
Yeah.
we belong to a religion where uh, it is unambiguously said that if I make a statement and it can in 99 ways be interpreted as disbelief, as kufr, as heresy, but there's only one way in which it can be interpreted in a positive light, in a faith affirming light, it should be taken in that one way.
Yeah.
Right? This is a part of solid Islamic doctrine.
Yeah.
Um,
Give people the benefit of the doubt.
always, always. And think about it this way. Quranically, in one book, you have God Himself saying, the heavens and the earth tear themselves apart every time you say that God has begotten a son.
Yeah.
And that same religion also allows you to marry Christians,
Yeah.
to let a Christian raise your child. You can marry a Christian woman,
Yeah.
right? That, for me, is the embodiment of intellectual charity,
Yeah.
which is saying that I have my own positions. That doesn't mean I'm going to degrade yours.
Yeah.
I hold my own positions with great force. I don't water them down at all. But in every engagement that I have with someone who sees the world another way, I make my case, but don't mistreat them or degrade them for it.
Yeah.
And I think that is the kind of attitude and the kind of openness that both Ibn Sina and both Al Ghazali have.
Yes.
So in that sense, I view both of their projects as Islamic in ambition.
Yes.
You get what I mean?
I get what you mean. Now, with Ibn Sina, let's start with Ibn Sina. So, Ibn Sina is basically an extremely gifted polymath type figure. His medicinal works became the standard canon for medical practice for centuries, even after his demise.
Yeah, and not just that. I mean, so you see his success in the hard sciences.
Yeah.
And then you see him basically make the biggest innovations in metaphysics, arguably since Aristotle, maybe, or the Greek masters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And he's essentially the steward of people who came in that intellectual stead
Yeah.
for 1,000 years after,
Yes.
right? And as you've been telling me, and as I've read in different places, for everyone from the Oases to Andalusian Jews to certain sections of Ismailis, everyone has taken inspiration from Ibn Sina and his work.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Particularly the Neoplatonic provenance he tries to merge with Islamic ideas. I think this becomes extremely, extremely important with, I would say, his main core concept, which is like, contingency and necessary beings. So the main focus of Ibn Sina's entire philosophical works is largely to do with a branch of metaphysics called ontology. Ontology is essentially the study of being. What is there? What is real? How real is it? Is there a scale of, things that are real and things that are not? Let me give you a practical example. So, are only abstract things real? Like, is this chess piece real? Or are tangible things real, like this chess piece? Or are abstract ideas like justice also real? So how do we differ between these things? What makes something more real and less real? So those are the type of questions that ontology essentially tries to wrestle with. And Ibn Sina's philosophical works primarily are centered around ontology, especially the ontology of human existence and the ontology of God,
Yeah.
and the relationship between.
Yeah, they have like essential link in his metaphysics.
Yes.
The creation and the created are inseparable.
Yeah. To go back on the ontological discussion, right? You can't get into what Ibn Sina does without a few important elements. The first thing being, is the world being or is the world becoming? So the Greek masters, Parmenides, posits that the world is being. The world is as it is. All existence is stationary, stable. What Heraclitus says is that all existence is in constant flux. existence is defined by change after every second. So no 1 second is the same as the previous second as it. A good way to
Just a question.
Yeah.
Does that in any way correspond with the Ibn Sina's ideas of motion in the universe?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, okay, just come to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
naturally.
I'm giving you a
okay,
background
okay,
of
okay.
how we'll
Sure,
end
sure,
up
sure.
where he's at.
Okay.
Okay. So let's bring it down to the earth. Is the world being or is the world becoming? Suppose you see a river today. It's got the same riverbanks, it's got the same tree, it's got the same structure, idea, riverness of that river. This is the river today. Tomorrow, it is that exact same river, but the water flowing it is different water because rivers flow and the water has changed. It's not going to be still water, right? Is it the same river? That is the essential crux of is the world being or is the world becoming? Is that river the same as the river yesterday or is it a different river? So this is a very, very important and a bit of a mindfuck type of question, that
Some of the stuff is pretty hard to wrap your head around.
it's very, very difficult to wrap your head around. And then we get Plato. Plato tries to synthesize these two views, where he says that there is an essential world of being and there is also an essential world of becoming. Now, what does this mean? He says that our material world is, in fact, as Heraclitus put it, a world of constant flux. It is a world of constant
becoming.
change. It's the world of becoming, it's the material world. However, this is an imperfect world that merely tries to imitate the more real world, which is Parmenides' world of being, where there are ideal, perfect, universal form. This is the world of forms. This is basically Plato's way of marrying the two things, where he says that, in the ideal sphere of things, in the universal concepts of things are static, things are being. Like there is the Platonic ideal of a horse. You know the characteristics of that horse. It has a certain way it looks, it has a certain way it moves, it has certain properties that make it horse. There's hoarseness. In that horse.
Hoarseness and equanimity.
That's the quiddity, that's the essence of the
Yeah.
horse, okay? But its material manifestation is in fact becoming, where it is subject to a lot of the different factors that govern the material world, where there's what does this horse eat? Where does this horse live? When was this horse born? All of these things are constantly changing by every second to second. So the material world is a world of becoming. So Plato finds a brilliant way of bridging these two things together. Now,
so the essence
yeah,
is the being, and the flux, the act of creation of that thing is the becoming. Or no?
No, not quite. Not quite. This is the being and becoming spectrum. But being and becoming remain as very, very central pillars even in Ibn Sina's work. But what he does is that he adds a different element to it, which is essence and existence. So let's give up what essence means.
No, what I'm trying to get at is, does the being becoming map onto essence and existence? Because I'm familiar with the essence existence thing.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the being and becoming.
Yeah.
So does it map on?
Yeah, it does.
Right?
It does.
That's what I'm trying to ask.
It does.
That's what I'm trying to ask.
There is consonance to it, but a little bit more nuance. He refines the concept. Let's put it like that. He refines the concept a lot by adding a lot of different, possibilities of being and possibilities of becoming. Let's put it like that. And that is manifested through,
Such as something being possible but not necessary. Or,
yes.
Yeah.
But
largely you can make a kind of relationship.
You can. Yeah. There's
a lineage there.
There's a lineage there, but he adds more subcategories.
Okay.
Let's put it like that. So essence and existence are his two genius ideas, which ultimately serve as a refinement on the being versus becoming framework. So essence. What is the essence of something? Essence is like the whatness of something. Essence is like the hoarseness of a horse, So, but the essence of something has no bearing on whether it
The thing
exists or
is
not.
real. Exactly.
Practical example. We know the essence of a unicorn. We know what are the properties of a unicorn. We know that a unicorn has a certain horn on its head like this.
That doesn't mean it exists.
This has no bearing on whether the unicorn exists or not. Abstract concepts, justice, things like this. We understand the universal essence of what justice is. It doesn't mean that justice has to exist as a tangible thing in the real world. Existence is a tangible material manifestation of that essence. You get what I mean? So that's how he breaks it down. Just because something has an essence doesn't mean it has to exist. Another example, You can have an entirely coherent blueprint of a building without that building ever being built. That doesn't negate the essence of that blueprint, right?
So, for example, you create a blueprint and you name it the Burger Tower, okay? And now we know the whatness of the Burger Tower because it's been designed down to a T.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the Burger Tower actually exists.
Yeah. So the essence of the Burger Tower has no bearing on whether it exists or not. It could exist, it's possible it exists, but there is nothing in of the essence of the Burger Tower itself that suggests it has to exist. It has to necessarily exist. So from this we get into the concept of contingent beings.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Burger Tower existing is contingent
Yeah.
on
A bunch of different
things
factors,
playing out.
A bunch
Yeah.
of different things playing out.
And that is true for basically everything except one thing.
Basically everything except one thing. So all beings are subcategorized into two possible modes of existence: contingent beings and necessary beings. Now let's go into contingent beings first. Contingent beings are basically those beings, those things, those concepts, those whatevers that rely on something outside of themselves for their existence in the temporal world. Practical example: there's nothing about you that suggests you have to exist in the material
Yeah.
world. You are contingent upon the air you breathe, the water you drink, your parents conceiving you, X, Y, Z, a myriad of different
And
things.
all of those things that you've just pointed to,
Yeah.
that I am contingent on,
Are also contingent upon
infinitely
something. Yeah.
contingent
The water
upon
you're
something
drinking
else.
is also contingent upon the bottle being fulfilled. The bottle being fulfilled also is contingent upon somebody pouring it. It's an infinite
goes on
chain.
forever.
It's an
Yeah.
infinite chain of contingency. So nothing essentially carries the reason for its own existence. That is the crux of contingency.
Existing through another.
Existing through another. Everything exists through another. Nothing is
Existing through itself,
Yeah.
bar one.
one thing. And that is a necessary being. So the necessary being is essentially God.
Yeah.
So God is the one being whose essence is existence. Because if we can think of
According to Ibn Sina.
according to Ibn Sina, yeah. So if we can formulate a certain being whose essence matches its existence out of pure necessity of that thought that has to kind of exist in some dimension, unless it's a logical contradiction like a square circle. That's an impossible existence, you know. You can't have a square circle. That doesn't make any sense. But for the necessary being, its essence is existence, you know. So it's not contingent upon anything. That's the essential idea of the necessary being.
So why is it necessary being and not necessary beings?
Why there is only a single necessary being is because, okay, firstly, the necessary being, right? The necessary being must be simple. It must be unitary in its existence. There can't be something that is similar to it. It can't be material. It can't be manifested in this world. Why are all of these things there? Because the necessary being, because its essence is existence, it's not contingent on anything else for its existence, right? So like we were talking about contingent beings like my phone is contingent upon the parts that make it up, okay? So it depends on its parts. God or the necessary being cannot be contingent on any parts. So if it has a material manifestation, it is now contingent upon its material body. So it can't be material. If it is similar to anything else in the world, then its conception is contingent to that similarity. So it can't be similar to anything, right? It must be extremely unique. And it must be one. Why does it have to be one? Because if there are two, they will inevitably be
Some part
some
that differentiates
parts
one from
that
the other.
differentiate one from the other. So there will be some similarities and some differences.
And if there's a part, that means the simplicity and unitariness of the being has been complicated. Which
Exactly.
means that it's no longer
Yes,
simple in one.
exactly. So if they were totally same, if there was no difference between them, they would be one and they would not be two.
Exactly.
But because they have some differences between them that separate them, they are contingent on that difference. Their existence as two and not one is contingent upon those differences. You know? So it cannot logically you can't
You
have
know
two.
what? I've read a really interesting insight on this. So
Yeah.
basically, Thomas Aquinas affirmed this idea
Yeah.
of oneness in God.
Yeah.
He agreed with this largely. So then the rabbit hole I went down, my natural thing was, how do you hold this position, but also hold the Trinitarian position of three is one,
Yeah.
right? And there was a very interesting answer to that, where basically Thomas Aquinas says, this is one being, distinct, singular, but there are three relations within it. So,
Yeah.
for example, I can, as an individual, I exist, but to you, I am a friend. To my sister, I am a brother. So there a system of different relations within the whole,
Yes.
but the whole remains uncomplicated.
Yeah.
Do I agree with that reasoning? Not necessarily, but it's interesting to see
It is
how someone
downstream.
like him
Yeah.
dealt with that.
I'll explain also in a bit how exactly it's downstream from the work Ibn Sina did.
Yeah.
So you have the necessary being. So the necessary being is unitary, it's immaterial, it is without any comparison, it is God, essentially. Okay. So because, okay, coming back to contingent being for a second, because contingent beings are basically a chain of contingencies, the entire world is a chain of contingencies, right? That go on to infinity, right? There's nothing, that chain of contingency must be undergirded by something that is not contingent upon something. You know, there has to be a starting point, right? Otherwise, if I just expand the chain of contingency into infinity, let's say trees exist because of sunlight and water. Sunlight and water exist because of environment. Environment exists because of the space. The space exists because of X, Y, Z. I go on till forever. So no matter how many more explanations I add, right, you still don't have a logical solution to the fact that everything is kind of contingent upon each other. So Ibn Sina's great breakthrough was that, no, expanding a chain into infinity does not somehow make itself grounding. It still needs to be undergirded by something, and that's where the necessary being comes in. The necessary being is not part of this chain. His essence, his emanation is what provides life or provides intellectual data points or whatever you want to say to all the contingent beings. So what happens is that the necessary being, the one, emanates. It emanates itself because it can only, how do I say it, contemplate its own existence. It creates the first intellect. Now, the first intellect is defined.
Just talk.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the emanation bit. So just to expand on the emanation bit,
Yeah.
because that is a bit of a interesting concept. So the idea behind emanation is that the world or creation emanates from God the way, say, light does from the sun.
Yes.
Perfection so perfect that it can't help but
Overflow.
radiate and overflow.
Yes.
Right? Now, to get more technical,
Yeah.
How does Ibn Sina himself justify this reasoning? It's that he implies that there can be no change in God.
Yes.
Why can't
God is
he
singular?
argues,
Yeah.
Why can't there be any change in God? Because external causes cause change in created things.
Yes.
So, and because no external cause can act on the first cause,
Yes.
there can be no change in God.
Yes.
Right. So this comes to the question of, is the universe, is the created universe eternal,
Yeah.
co-eternal with God, or is it created in time?
Yes.
Right. Ibn Sina says it's co-eternal with God.
Yeah.
Now,
and it cannot be created in time because that implies
a change in
a
God.
change.
Because
yes.
what the implication of that is that there was a time at which God wanted to not create the universe, and then there was a time at which God
changed his
created
mind.
the universe.
Yeah, and that implies
change-
parts.
That
That implies a
that
presence
implies
of
a-
different parts.
no, that
in
I-
God.
No, the reason that's particularly problematic is because it implies the existence of an external cause that caused him to change his mind.
That also, but also the core crux of it is parts. Because if God changed his mind, right? God has an intellect that changes, and if he changes, he's contingent on the part of him which changes.
So that can also be drawn from it.
That's what I got it from it.
But now, I think that
So he necessarily emanates into the first intellect, which is basically
no, just so it implies a certain kind of change in God.
Yeah.
Right. And no external cause is supposed to be able to cause a change in the first cause.
Yeah.
Right. Or imply that he has some parts, as you said.
Yeah.
Now, that means the universe would have always had to have existed in a way that is co-eternal with God.
Yes.
Right. So how is that possible? Through emanation, as in it coexisted with him from the very first moment, and he did not decide to create it at a particular moment in time.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. So the logical thing that happened with God and why God or the necessary being only creates one thing and not two. He creates one thing, which is the first intellect, the most perfect emanated being, which is almost like a mirror of God. That's the way you can put it. Why can the necessary being only produce one thing? Because from one, only one can come. What does that mean? If God creates two things, that means that there's a cognition that if one is going one way and the other, like his mind is not made up, So that is a change in God's mind, So God cannot emanate two things. The necessary being cannot emanate two things. It must only emanate one, because from one, only one can come. And if two things come from God, then that implies a split in God, because if two things are coming, that implies two separate parts of God.
It
Do you get
corrupts
what I mean?
it corrupts the Ibn Sina's idea of a perfectly simple original first.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So he can't emanate two things. He emanates one thing. And that first thing that he emanates is the first intellect, which is the most perfect emanated being. Now, the first perfect emanated being, and this is where the triadic connection becomes very, very interesting with Aquinas, is that the first emanated being, right, contemplates three things. It contemplates itself as necessary, as the first chain of the contingent cycle that is separate from God. It contemplates itself as contingent upon that first being. And the third thing, it contemplates itself as a necessary being as well.
That's the third thing.
Yeah. Fundamentally, it contemplates itself as a necessary being. It contemplates itself as a necessary being out of virtue of being the first in the contingency chain. And it also contemplates itself as contingent upon the one actual necessary being. So that's the triad. That might have something to do with the triadic pattern that and out of
so
this.
Even there, you could make an argument that it's not necessarily three distinct parts; it's three distinct relations.
Yes, yes. So out of these contemplations create that this gets very, very technical and cosmological, where you get the soul of the sphere, of the level of the intellect, and the body of it. So, and out of that flows another intellect.
So you mentioned cosmology. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay, so basically, Ibn Sina basically says that between God, the one, and human life on earth, the material world, right, there's 10 levels that separate us from him. Okay, so like we described earlier, you have the first intellect. Out of the first intellect, then comes the soul of the world, which is like the universe.
The world soul.
The world soul. Now we're getting into the space of the world soul. Now, what is the world soul? So you have the intellect from 2 to 9, right? Just denote essentially different levels of space in a way. If I want to get really, really rudimentary, I'll give you the significance of why there are those levels of space, but it's basically a bunch of different levels of space. For example, the second intellect corresponds with the fixed stars, so which is like the architectural makeup of the universe. The fixed stars in the sky, everything you see. The third intellect then becomes the sphere of Saturn. So Saturn, and then it flows downwards from planet to planet down until you get to Earth. So you got
just to ask you,
yeah.
What is the origin of all this? Like, because to me, even as someone who's relatively familiar with this, I'd say, it seems so arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like I could, say I decide to invert this someday.
Yeah.
Right? Say now, as a 21st century child, I know about the different layers, the mantle, and everything going down to the core of the earth. And I say that I'm going to build a new earthology instead of a cosmology. What's stopping me from doing that? What are the origins of this science?
Okay, so the origins of the science lie in like two particular things, which is Babylonian astral tradition that ends up through cross-pollination being adopted by the Greeks during Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, and Neoplatonism. So in terms of the Babylonian astral religion, so what they basically noticed, what in Mesopotamia these guys noticed was that the planets, the fixed planets in the sky, right? Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, etc., the 7 main planets, have specific properties. and they have specific distances that they calculated away from the world. So this is the time where the universe, the cosmos, was structured around a geocentric model rather than a heliocentric model. As in, we thought that the world was the center of the universe and everything orbited around it. So how they would look at it, and they were like, Saturn moves the slowest. Mercury and the moon move the fastest, right? So that calculates the distance between us and them. So Saturn being the furthest away and the moon being closest to us, because they move the fastest, they complete their rotational cycles faster. Okay, so coming back to the intellects, how does Ibn Sina bridge this with the concept of intellects? Why is the third intellect Saturn? Why is the fourth intellect Jupiter? Why is the fifth intellect Mars?
Is the order of the planets.
It is
in terms of their closeness.
It is the reversed order of the planets in closeness to the world. For example, Moon is the closest to Earth. Therefore, it is the 10th. It is the 10th intellect, I believe. Yeah. Ninth intellect, and I think the 10th is the active intellect. Sorry.
Yeah.
Saturn, because it's furthest away from the world, and the world being the domain of material change, corruption, flux, right? And Saturn moving the slowest, it is the furthest away from the world. It takes about 29 years for Saturn to complete its cycle according to the geocentric model, right? It is the slowest to change, and because it is slowest to change, it is closest to God. You understand? Because their necessary being is a God that is unchanged. And because Saturn changes the slowest, its literal position in the universe is slowest, right? It is closest to God. What changes its position the fastest is the moon. So the moon is the furthest away from the God. So that's how they kind of structured the emanation cycle. That's the logic behind the cosmology. Coming back to Babylonian astral religion, so they said that they looked at the planets, and in very, very Jungian fashion, they affiliated those planets with certain qualities. For example, Mars. Mars is a red planet, a red fiery looking planet. What is the connotation behind red? Passion, fire, war, death, destruction. So this is how kind of the ancients, basically the Babylonians and the Greeks, looked at Mars or Ares and said this is the god of war, because of that planet. Because that planet corresponded with their psychological archetypes of what such a god would be. So the Babylonians basically identified the archetypes of the planets, and they corresponded it with their polytheistic pantheon of gods.
Before you go on with the intellects, what is the purpose? What is the telos behind the chain? What purpose does this serve? Why is it useful to know this?
So what purpose it serves is that from every emanation, like from God comes the first intellect. The first intellect contemplates on 3 levels, and out of that first intellect comes the second intellect, and so on. There's this triadic pattern that's occurring across every intellect until we come down to the material world. The specific, are you asking exactly why the planetary structure in order 1 to 10 is important, or what are you asking is important?
This entire tree of life thing, this entire system.
Yeah.
What does it do? And does it just explain the structure of the universe?
Yes.
Or that is the idea behind it, right?
Yeah.
And then for someone who is religious or someone who's trying to follow this as a system, is this are these the rungs you have to climb up to get to divinity?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what
so when your soul descends from the first intellect or the necessary being itself down to the planet Earth, right? It basically gets its soul fragments on the way down from each of these intellects. So the first soul fragment it collects is from Saturn. So Saturn was the Greek and Babylonian god of limit, structure, Overton windows in a way.
So this system of soul fragments and collecting bits of what you will become from these different intellects, is this a Babylonian idea, a Kabbalistic idea, or is this also something Ibn Sina subscribes to?
So Ibn Sina comes before the Kabbalists, so we don't want to mix that up. Where this idea comes from at its root is Pythagoras and from Neoplatonism. So Pythagoras, basically, they said that the Pythagoreans essentially discovered that mathematical proportion is the fundamental reality of the entire cosmos. And because of this, right, the cosmos has its own soul. So the cosmos has its own qualities. Okay? So that's what they kind of discovered. So yeah, the Pythagoreans basically discovered that the cosmos is rational. The cosmos, basically, each planet has its own soul, and the human soul descends by collecting fragments of each of these planets down to Earth. Okay? Plato also kind of subscribed to an idea similar to this, where Plato says that, God acts through rational intermediaries, and those rational intermediaries are these planetary archetypes. You know, Neoplatonism is the most sophisticated way of structuring all of this elite ball knowledge in a single system, where they come out with and say that, so there's the one which is equivalent to the necessary being. Then there is the intellect. Intellect is, for one to one, corresponds with even Ibn Sina's first intellect. And then there is the soul. The soul is on the Neoplatonic level, the third level, before the material world comes. But what Ibn Sina did is that he brought in Babylonian astral religion, and he brought in the Pythagorean tradition into this and merged it into Neoplatonism, and he expounded on what the soul was. And that's where he basically got this planetary cosmology from. By bridging a bunch of, it was a bit syncretistic. And you have to also remember, at this time, right, the scientific view of the world was that the entire cosmos revolves around the world. It's a geocentric model. So from furthest to closest, this is how the structure is. Additionally, Pythagoras also said that 10 is a divine number, because 10 symbolizes the end and start of a new cycle. So even though Ibn Sina didn't necessarily think of it like, I need to come up with 10 intellects, it just ended up becoming the necessary philosophical system he had to make, because he had to account for the 7 planets. There is God, the first intellect itself, which is the world soul, and then you have, the active intellect that makes the world, and you have the material world. So on every 10 levels, right, just by coincidence, he comes up with all these different schools of thought that end up converging in Ibn Sina's cosmology.
So is this like a, golden ratio type naturally occurring thing where like a lot of people just end up with this conclusion where 10 is a thing here, and then, in pantheons, it's like 12 in Rome, 12 in Greece. It's like one of these recurring archetypes in nature.
Yeah.
Right? I can see that. Like
for those guys, it was not just arbitrary. There was deep intellectual rigor into coming up with this thing.
I'm not knocking it as a system.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some underpinnings. A lot of people have the opinion that it's more on the occult side of things.
Yeah.
And I might tend to agree with that.
Yeah.
But to me, like at some level, and I might sound like a douchebag for saying this, but it's like, okay, now Pluto's classified as a planet. What are you going to do now? Okay.
Yeah.
My more serious quip behind the quip, my serious contention is, with that limited scope of what you knew the universe to be at the time, you came up with this incredibly complex system.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder what has happened, or if there's been any innovation in these systems since we've been able to look beyond our solar system.
I wouldn't know that.
Yeah, but that would be. The thing is, it's so recent. I'm sure there's no settled science around that.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there are these kinds of guys who are kind of delving into. 100% there are.
Absolutely, they are. Absolutely, they are. They're reaccounting it for the geocentric model instead. I'm sure they are. They didn't get into that much depth, but basically, his cosmological emanation structure was both philosophically rigorous. It corresponded with the primary Ptolemaic astronomy of the time. It corresponded with Pythagoras's, 10 being a divine number of, start and end. The world starts and ends at 10. That's why he has the 10 intellect. So there were a bunch of, there was just, you have the Neoplatonic and Babylonian astral tradition as well. So a bunch of these quite rich and rigorous traditions ended up converging in the same place. And that's how Ibn Sina got his cosmology. And that cosmology is also, in a way, not necessarily even just unique to him, because even if you look at Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah is essentially following the same emanatory structure as Ibn Sina's intellect structure. And why is this relevant? Because not to say that Ibn Sina was inspired by the Kabbalists, but vice versa. Because Ibn Sina's entire emanatory structure became quite popular, especially in the Andalusian world, which was like, Islamic Spain at the time, which was exactly the frontier when Muslim and Jewish scholars, philosophers were meeting a lot, because this is the place where most of the Jews were there in Spain at the time, and that was also the frontiers where, although this system did not catch much acceptance in the Islamic world for a lot of different reasons that we'll go into later, the Jews kind of adapted this, and they used this entire framework to make their Kabbalistic framework. Not just this, there's the Neoplatonic element as well, but nobody had, with as much rigor, created this emanatory structure as Ibn Sina. So it was profoundly consequential to maybe not our religion, but the Jewish and Christian religions for sure.
What's your instinct on it? Like, it makes sense then that most of the systems that adopt this metaphysical approach to God
Yeah.
are either closed orders or initiatory orders,
Yeah.
because it is so complex
Yeah.
that, like, this is not just something that you can pick up one day, and or like, it's not like approaching Christianity or Islam, where to different degrees, but doctrine's pretty straightforward if you really look
Yeah.
into it.
Yeah.
Right? Do you think there's a relationship there? Because I think there is.
Between exactly what?
Between how complex the theology is,
Yeah.
and how closed the system is.
What do you mean by closed?
Because the orders that employ this, or the followers of these systems, are few and far between. It's concentrated, it's gate kept,
Yeah.
it's certain upper echelons often,
Yeah.
or initiatory orders, or post Sufi orders, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
or Kabbalistic orders. I think there's a relationship there.
No. In that regard, absolutely, there is. Because here's the thing, it's a very, even though there is a rational explanation behind why it emanates this certain way, there's also mystical side to it where, to really grapple with it, you have to experience it itself. So, like we said earlier, the soul collects soul fragments from all of these different emanatory levels on the way down to material world, and in order for the soul to be reunited with the one, it has to reverse the order as well. It needs to strip itself of the soul fragments on its way up as well. So I need to go from the moon to Saturn, and you strip all the elements in between them to get reunited with the one. So that is a very initiatory idea. How do you do that? It's not quite exactly, it's not exactly 2 plus 2, is it, right? So there, you are right about it.
When I look at it from a moral perspective, my issue with all of this, like, look, there's the pure doctrinal thing where, from an Islamic angle, I don't think it sits right with me. I think it's contradictory to what I perceive the structure of the universe to be, which is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Right? There's one creator, then there's creation. I believe in creation, like, in a way that's pretty contradictory to Neoplatonists. But in an almost like SJW kind of way, my issue with these kinds of systems, and this doesn't automatically invalidate them,
Yeah.
but also for me it kind of does, is that I think anything that promises you salvation should be easily graspable. And what I mean by that is, it shouldn't have 10 intellects, which after reading about many times and just being explained to by you, I still don't understand.
Yeah.
Okay? And like, look,
Yeah. It's tough to grasp.
there's the universality of mankind, in which everyone has the same fundamental worth and chance of salvation. And I always say this, that doesn't make you equal in worldly things. It doesn't make you equally as smart or good looking or rich or any of those things, right?
Yeah.
But I genuinely believe in my heart of hearts that the ultimate mission, which is a divine mission of salvation, of ascending in various ways, that in proportion needs to be equally accessible to everyone. Right?
Here's the thing. Now,
And with orders like this,
Yeah.
it becomes a lot more difficult.
yes, grounding it back to
Salvation should be open.
Yes. Okay, so there's levels to this, okay? So coming back to Ibn Sina, right? So Ibn Sina viewed this emanatory structure as not necessarily there open or even to be able to be understood by the many. It is for the few. But his entire project was ultimately the basis that, philosophy and religion don't have to be contradictory. They're telling the same thing. It's just they're coming through it through very, very different mechanisms. So Ibn Sina himself, I think he was a Muslim, and I think there are aspects of him that might indicate that he was devout as well. But this was a degree of, intellectual, how do I say it, looseness that a lot of the philosophers at the time were going down. Some of them ended up in closed order initiatory circles like we see later on. But with Ibn Sina in particular, he said that no, religion is perfectly fine for the masses. This is for those who understand it. We both end up at the same destination, though, like he did say this.
So look, I respect his. So for example,
Yeah.
I'll say that in God's knowledge of particulars, right?
Yeah.
That debate. While ultimately I don't agree with Ibn Sina's position at all, but it deserves a bit more charity than it gets, right?
Yeah.
So for example, his argument is that there is a metaphysical boundary which constrains the way the first unitary simple God knows everything.
Yeah.
So he's saying he does know everything, but in a way that
It's not personal, it's universal.
as causes of causes, because he is the first mover.
Yeah.
He is the first cause. He knows everything that will be caused by that cause. So he does know everything, but it's different in the way from how we know everything.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I understand, and the reason I feel like, not trying to judge his faith here,
Yeah.
but in a positive sense, you could say that what he's ultimately trying to do is affirm the simplicity of the one, right? And he's trying to argue for a very pure kind of monotheism.
Yeah,
That
and-
is his goal.
Yeah.
But
And
my
to give
issue with
credit
that,
as well, the contingency argument, which was a very, very logically and rationally sophisticated argument, does start from him, which is
yes, but at the same time, my issue with that is, while I understand why the goal is noble and I can appreciate the effort and the sophistication, it seems to me again to be putting very firm, almost linguistic traps on what is supposed to be the creator of the universe. Right?
yeah. See, here's the thing with the philosophers in general, right? Which Ibn Sina was a microcosm of. Their thing was that knowledge must be accepted where it can be found. If the scientific, the rational explanation lies in what the Greeks did and what the Babylonians did and what the Neoplatonists did, right? We shouldn't ignore it. We should try to synthesize it under an Islamic umbrella, which they did in good faith a lot of the times try to do. I do agree with you that there were excesses in it.
No, but what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
particularly, is almost like I feel like.
It takes
know,
away
I've
the
created
democratic
a-
aspect of it.
No. Think about it this way. That's another thing. I'm saying, imagine you've created a video game, right? And you've programmed it with a certain kind of code. Imagine you're playing Pokemon.
Yeah.
Right? And in Pokemon, you know how you can't walk through the forest? Like
Yeah.
the trees, there's a tree line, and you just can't go through it.
Yeah.
Right? Like imagine like like Ash Ketchum starts pondering over the nature of the real universe, right? And the logic that he uses to deduce certain things is that which he is given in his limited world, right? In that code that was specifically prescribed to create his reality,
Yeah.
right? And when the philosophers try to over-explain God using what, in my opinion, are almost sometimes just linguistic acrobatics, that's what they're kind of doing.
Yeah. In certain ways, yeah. Look, what they're trying to do,
Like, you know,
ultimately,
when
I'll tell
Ghazali,
you,
for example,
I'll tell you. Let me tell you where I think that there is excesses and there is moral hazard, is where they are trying to decode a system that doesn't necessarily require decoding because of the slippery slopes it can lead into. So I'll give you a practical example of this. Now we keep talking about Kabbalah and the striking resemblance between the Kabbalistic tree of life and the 10 intellects, where, let me give you an example. The fifth intellect is Mars. The fifth Sephirot in Kabbalah is Jevura, which stands for strength. Strength, Mars, war, they correspond to the same thing. Even if you do a quick Google of what does Jevura correspond with or what is Jevura, you will see that even the Kabbalists associate that with the planet Mars. Okay? Now, Kabbalah, it in itself is just a mystical tradition. I don't want to go too deep in condemning something I don't entirely understand, but I will rely on the authority of early stage Kabbalists and Jewish mystics themselves, like Maimonides, who were deeply influenced by Ibn Sina, who did see extreme moral hazard in the system. And the, the first level Kabbalah practitioners as well said that practical Kabbalah, using this stuff, using this elite ball knowledge to essentially do magic on the world, is dangerous. Do not touch this stuff. So, what I look at it as is like, it is a valid and extremely powerful code that a lot of different traditions have independently come towards to decode the nature of reality. The way Rene Guénon and their traditionalists and the perennialists would say that, you know, there's a primordial tradition of unchanged knowledge, of historical knowledge that can be found in every tradition. They only use different symbolic language. It is the same thing with something like this. So a lot of people are independently coming at it through this lens, and so was Ibn Sina.
so I've got
The
a lot of
Kabbalists,
I've got a lot of sympathy for that, the perennialist idea.
that's what they say. Yeah.
And almost, I mean, this is like, you know, I always like, we have this conversation about eternal monotheism versus polytheism, and I feel like whether it's one or two or three strains of or strings of knowledge that have run throughout space and time, whether one is monotheism and one is polytheism and one is something in between.
Yeah.
And, you know, take your pick, where does Ibn Sina fall?
Yeah.
There are easily identifiable consonances throughout space and time in, say what are monotheistic traditions, or what are Neoplatonic traditions,
Yeah.
or what are purely polytheistic traditions.
Yeah.
Is there?
Neoplatonism, basically, let's call it the school of Neoplatonism and everything that comes downstream from Neoplatonism. So, this stuff, I don't necessarily see it as being a slippery slope into polytheism. I do see it as a slippery slope into spiritual corruption, in the sense that all Hermetic traditions, black magic traditions, Aleister Crowley, even the more excessive aspects of Kabbalah, are ultimately downstream from this exact cosmology. And that's where the danger really lies, not necessarily in polytheism, in spiritual corruption. Because if you understand the structure of this universe, which a lot of these people claim they do, and there is, you know, some evidence to suggest that they might be onto something extremely unsettling, like numerology, like gematria, where you have a lot of extreme numerology practitioners, which is also downstream from this same tradition, who claim and who have in certain points demonstrated that they can use that to predict the future.
What is gematria? Just
manipulate.
give us like a one-liner.
Man, it's basically gematria. Numerology is also
It's a kind of numerology. I think
it's Hebrew numerology. It's Jewish numerology, where they say that the Hebrew alphabet, the language, is like essentially a sacred operating code from God Himself that you can use to kind of decode the material world and then eventually repair it. Tikkun olam is what they call it. But the Hebrew alphabet and the Hebrew numerology.
So give us an example of how you'd use it.
Huh?
Give us an example of how you'd use it, for example.
I couldn't tell you because I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. There's a guy who you can kind of consult with. There's this guy, GG 33.
Okay.
Gary 33, he's a Jewish guy who's a numerology practitioner. You can go on YouTube and watch his stuff.
So, but they'll do things
And-
like, for example, oh, it's the 9th day of the 9th month, so I'm going to bet on Babar Azam making 9 runs in the 9th over or
Yes, something like this. It's a
Like,
lot.
I'm giving
it's
a random example.
It's a lot more sophisticated
yeah,
than this.
yeah.
A lot, like hell of a lot more.
Yeah.
Down to that, they do numerological decoding of people's names themselves. So alphabets have numerological consonances, like 1 is A, B is
Yeah,
2,
yeah,
stuff like this. So they're using a lot of it to decode a lot of stuff. So where there might be some type of spiritual corruption happening is that, okay, so downstream from the Neoplatonic tradition is this numerology stuff. And from the numerology, like for example, the Kabbalists, what they do is that they're going to reinterpret the Torah by using that alphanumerical consonances to reinterpret this. And those numbers themselves have certain properties. Like 1, now this is where we come full circle with the 10 intellects in Sephiroth. So 1 is the number of unity, like the 1. 2 happens to be the number of, like, kya kehte hain? Limits, multiplicity. And like there's just certain.
Bro, even Islamic esotericists, like they'll, the Quranic letters like the Alif, Lam, Mim, they will try and decode them in this way as well.
Yes.
So there's a tradition of that in all the Abrahamic
consonants
religions,
between letters and numbers.
Okay. But I feel like, what you were saying earlier about like the alphanumeric code, and you're using, say, your religious scripture to decipher the alphanumeric code of everything, right?
Yeah.
So in my worldview, it would be something like, I'm a Muslim, I'm using my text, but the people playing around with it, doing this esoteric, black magic adjacent stuff, they're tapping into the same fundamental code of reality, but they're doing it, they're playing around with it. They're trying to manipulate it.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier and just bring it full circle is the land thing.
Yeah.
Right? Land also acknowledges a code that is run throughout, or codes that run throughout reality.
Exactly.
And outside
It's
force.
a primordial code. Yeah.
And now the question is he acknowledging a telos, a theological logic, or not? Sorry, kind of. Again, bro.
So land basically says that this alphanumerical system, this operating boot system of Kabbalah or something to say, is just like Kabbalah and the Jewish people or the Jewish tradition is basically a vessel for this primordial elite ball knowledge. Before them, other people had access to this. There's a possibility you can make that Ibn Sina also discovered something along these lines. And then I think let's get the conversation back down to earth is that why did this not get popular in the Islamic world? This got popular in the Jewish world. This got popular in the Christian world. Not saying that black magic and not even esotericism, but like kala jadoo. Not saying it didn't happen in the Islamic world. It was a lot less profound and it was a lot more pushed back against than these other.
Or we can at least say that it was never turned into like this mainstream movement the way different magics in different cultures were accepted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
like our Sufis, for instance,
Yeah.
they're dabbling with a bit of metaphysics. They're playing around with those ideas. They're dabbling with like stages of spiritual progression. But no one straight up like doing any kind of weird organized magic thing or anything like that.
Yeah. And I would honestly say that 99% of Christian and Jewish mystics are not either.
Yeah.
But because theirs is...
But there are organized movements there.
There are organized movements there, and because their religions are fundamentally subject to change, like a thing that Islam takes pride in is that, it is unchanged and it cannot be changed.
This is a system of closed symbols.
It's a system of closed symbols.
There's only so far you can take it.
There's only so far you can go playing around with this stuff before it's like straight up, this is not allowed. So that's also a reason why like Ibn Sina's system was not liked by the majority of Muslim people, and why it never got too widely adopted in Islamic circles, and why Al Ghazali really goes up against it and says that this is a very, very slippery slope that borders on heresy that we cannot go down. the closed symbol system is not necessarily there in Christianity and Judaism. Judaism, because their primary book is not the Torah but the Talmud, which is a collection of thousands and years of rabbinical debate rather than divine scripture itself, and that takes precedence over the Torah. And even with Christianity, is just how many different schools you have going on. It's like it's kind of tough. It's like Orthodox Christianity and Protestantism is as different as Islam and Hinduism, essentially. That's how many strains of Christianity there really are there,
And look, just to kind of nuance it a little bit, we have an angle of scholars coming in the way of simple understanding of religion. We also have the problem of sectarianism, but despite all that, I think that disagreement on the absolute fundamentals in Islam is not as deep as it could possibly be. So, for example, when I consider the entire web of the Islamic world, when you look at often the visual, aesthetic, and ritual differences between Sunnis and Shias and the many subsects of Sunnis and the many subsects of Shias, at the end of the day, considering how historically sometimes we haven't gone along with each other, and how even now the hardliners Sunnis, hardliners Shias, will be calling each other out, sometimes pushing each other out of the fold of religion. Considering all that, it is remarkable how we are still united on the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Even if, so when it comes to that,
Yeah.
so in like Sunni Shia debates, right, people will always be talking about the things that separate us.
Yeah.
Right? The people trying to sow discord will always be trying to talk about things that separate us. They will very rarely talk about the things that unite us, because the things that unite us, in my opinion, are stronger than those that separate us. So there is a fundamental kind of agreement. And this is not to legitimize or delegitimize any sect's theology, just to say that the stable core in the Islamic world, I think, tends to be very strong because of the rigidity of that symbolic world that we have.
Exactly. So the system ends up like not really catching much steam in Islam because be a divine intervention that says like we cannot accept this stuff. And I don't think Ibn Sina had any malevolent intentions or any heretical intentions with this. This was just a strain of knowledge that was extremely popular at that time and continued to be throughout millennia. This is probably the oldest mystical tradition ever. But there was a genuine, maybe coordinated or accidental push away from Islam from accepting
So the
stuff.
thing is, I feel like up to a certain point,
Yeah.
and I think Ghazali is also charitable here, and I think he's fair about it. He says that, look, up to a certain point where you were doing these metaphysical experiments and saying that this is one way of accessing or understanding the divine, he says, okay, this was superfluous, unnecessary, and sometimes corrupting or problematic, right? But till that extent, he's willing to give him some leeway, right? But then there's some spaces where he starts getting very theologically problematic, where he's saying that, look, everything's metaphorical.
Yeah.
Everything's metaphorical. There is no bodily resurrection.
Yeah.
We will not be reconstructed and made into people again. And over there, right, even in my attempt to be charitable to Ibn Sina, I think that some of his objections are totally nonsensical. Because, when Al Ghazali says that, look at the impossibility of creating you once, the creator can do it again. Right? But Ibn Sina's line there is ridiculous, and it just shows you that even such legendary minds can be so pedantic at times. So his reasoning is something like, no, once you've died and gone into the ground, there will be too much mixed up matter, so it will be difficult to create you again. This is part of the reasoning. So I'm like, bro, there was a positive case to be made for a metaphorical understanding of religion in his mind, but this was not that case. This, in my opinion, was a low quality case, and I think that if you were going to cross heretical lines, you don't even do it in a high quality way. But in that system of closed symbols and that rigidity, it is then perfectly understandable why there was such a hard pushback, right? Because when there is very clear scriptural announcement again and again that you will be raised again, fear the last day, right?
God knows particular. God knows you. God
Yeah.
answers your prayers. Like, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why we can get into why it just didn't catch steam in Islam. I think the most simple reason why is that, what we've always said, our book is not subject to change. It is divinely sanctioned, and this stuff will not, like,
It doesn't fly.
It just won't fly here. It won't come into being, and
It's like a fun experiment. It's like
Yeah.
interesting to think
Yeah.
about.
And
It's interesting knowing what
ultimately-
throughout Islamic history, what different strains of thoughts
Yeah.
came out. But ultimately, it's not
And
never
I
going to be
think,
dominant.
and now I'm going to get speculative here. I think also it's like, God kind of, there is some validity in the system. That's why it has lasted throughout so many different traditions. But God,
Oh, there's
meant it.
power in it.
There's power
There's
in
power.
it, and a lot of people have used it to make some absolutely mind-boggling things real. But I think ultimately God meant it to be that way. God gave this system, God gave this possibility as a force of potential intellectual corruption to man. It is allegorical in some ways to the forbidden apple, where it's like,
Yeah.
here is like everything you want to know can ever be accomplished through this alphanumerical operating system that is downstream from Neoplatonism and all this stuff. But you might be a great planner, but I am a better planner, and therefore understand it. Don't have too much intellectual pride in
No,
this.
I fully agree with you there.
Yeah.
Because it's like, bro,
So it's like God meant for, the world to kind of discover this stuff.
like when it comes to like the
Yeah.
fundamental understanding of God or the universe, I try my best to have the simplest, most low IQ, straightforward take.
Yeah.
And why I say that is, yes, for as an intellectual pursuit, I'll read all these things, and
Yeah.
we're talking about
But
it right
here's the
now.
thing, here's the thing, the
but
interesting
that
thing
doesn't
is-
need to be the way that you know God.
Yes, but here's the thing. The simplest explanation, right? Like, okay, now I've gone through this deep, I took 35 pages of notes for this episode to really understand it. So I go to this deep level of goonerism to understand all this concept, and the conclusion I come to is the same as the most simplistic conclusion, right?
Yeah,
which is
literally.
that, yeah, this happens to be there, yeah, this is questionable, and God put it there because it is questionable, and it is a tempting force that
It's very fascinating.
It's a fascinating force that kind of, in some ways, has led to a certain group of people conquering the world through this exact system. It was meant to be that way, and that's why it's a test.
It's kind of like I would
And
actually
that-
analogize
and-
it with like a deal with the devil.
Yeah,
Because it's like this is a bargain. If
Yeah.
you make it, if you go down this road, you will get to places that maybe, but I won't say otherwise you couldn't have, right? That's kind of like a disbelieving kind of stance. But it'll aid you in many worldly ways,
Yeah.
right? But you will be breaking a lot of divine covenants on the way to get there.
Yeah. So, and I think just out of that divine miracle, it's like it just didn't end up picking up steam here.
Yeah.
So we've kind of covered Ibn Sina's entire canon, from essence and existence to necessary and contingent beings, and then the cosmological emanation and structure. And although it is quite sophisticated, it is quite rigorous, it is quite logical in context of the time and the dominant ideas of the time, and it's quite an ambitious syncretistic project by mixing Neoplatonism, mixing Pythagorean number theory, mixing Babylonian astral religion, all within an Islamic framework. So it is highly ambitious, and it is highly impressive in the sense that maybe we did not find value in it, but a lot of other sects did, and they did use it very freely
Yeah.
and innovate a lot on it. Ultimately, it wasn't accepted in our canon, mostly. And the man who really puts Ibn Sina to sword in all of this is Al Ghazali. Yeah. So,
Man, so the challenge he mounts to Ibn Sina, I personally find very compelling. And one, obviously, because I agree with it, but it really is well argued. Like you said, if you're willing to steel man the F out of your opponent's case, you're also going to be able to come up with some pretty good arguments against it.
yeah.
And while some of the objections, for example, about the co-eternity of the universe with God,
Yeah.
right, versus the universe being a creation in time, over there, even though the answer to someone like me who is more theologically oriented it seems self-evident, it seems obvious.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it was to Al Ghazali as well. He still makes a philosophical argument,
Yes.
right? So for everyone or for anyone who suggests that Al Ghazali was anti-philosophy
Or
he-
anti-intellectual
or
or anti-rational.
anti-intellectual,
Not the case. He really understood
Yeah.
this stuff really, really deeply. Like as mentioned earlier, his summarizing works on the aims of the philosophers became widely accepted as a great way of actually understanding what the philosophers were about. So he understood this stuff deeply. In regards to the eternity of the world, what is the theological objection?
Man, so whereas Ibn Sina is basically arguing, as we've explained earlier, that the world being created in time implies a change in God, because if God decided to create the world at a particular moment in time, it means there was an earlier time where he did not want to create the world, and that implies a change in God.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas, just on the first level, one thinks, okay, but why can't the eternal being have decided or have always have decided to create this at a particular moment?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or then Ghazali's, which is something which is kind of adjacent to Ghazali's objection as well.
Yeah.
And I think that in that very simple way, he tackles the issue.
Yeah.
But
From a theological perspective, explicitly, it's because the co-eternity of the world implies that God is not a free agent, is not a free creator, which is the main crux of the theological objection to Ibn Sina's system, where it's like if God did not choose to create the world, but it necessarily overflows
Yeah.
from him, then God does not have free will. God is not omnipotent in Ibn Sina's emanatory
but
structure.
it almost like
So that's the main crux of the theological argument against it.
it almost like limits the metaphysical limits imposed on God. I mean, honestly, I think it's even generous to say that there are metaphysical limits imposed on the Avicennian God. It's almost, in my eyes, that God himself just becomes a metaphysical construct.
Yeah.
And in there, like, the moment you start saying things like God could not create in time even if he wanted to.
Yeah.
And he can't really want.
Because then he's
it is
contingent upon
yeah.
existing within time.
Yeah, and him wanting to implies an external force which made him want to do something.
Change his
and
mind, and
therefore,
there was a part in his mind that could have been changed, and therefore
yeah,
he's contingent
and
upon
it's like,
parts.
bro, at
Yeah.
some point you're like, it's above your pay grade, dog.
Yeah.
Like, it's, and I say this to all of humanity, it is above your pay grade, right? If Moses can go to the Mount Sinai and ask to bear witness to God and see him, and then the mountain is reduced to ashes, we have no chance. Like,
Yeah,
you
you
know?
will get one-shotted.
And yeah, you're gonna get one-shotted.
Yeah.
And again, this is not to say that you don't explore, right? But going down an intellectual rabbit hole
Yeah.
and making it your actual worldview are
Yeah.
two very different things.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's
we'll talk
one-
about this day and night, it doesn't mean we believe in
Yeah,
it.
and
One
there's a
shot.
difference between like the theological rebuttal, which is like self-evident to like most Muslims.
Yeah.
But Al-Ghazali, being a man of elite ball knowledge himself, gives a specifically philosophical rebuttal to this as well. Because he accepts Ibn Sina's premise that God cannot have created in time, because time is also God's creation, but he turns this around in itself. If every moment was equivalent before the creation of time in itself, there is no reason for there to be a starting point. There's no reason that singles out one moment
Yeah.
over the other, right? If they're all equal before creation itself.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. There is a first moment, right? And upon that basis, that implies God does have free will to choose that one particular moment over another. So the philosophical rebuttal to this entire thing is that no, bro, it can't be this way, because there is a specific start point, and that specific start point is literally a deep, deep implication of God's free will. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm gonna go like 80 IQ YouTuber explanation page on this and say that doesn't like the possibility or the theory of the Big Bang justify the creation in time hypothesis or theory that or feeling that monotheistic religions or our religion in particular has? I think it kind of does.
Yeah. I mean,
Maybe.
there's something that
Yeah.
caused that Big Bang,
Yeah.
right? That Big Bang is still contingent upon something
Yeah,
using Ibn
exactly.
Sina's framework, right? But what was that first thing?
Yeah.
That's still a specific moment in time that
And
doesn't
that he decided
will
to
itself into existence,
exactly,
right?
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
and that is
Exactly.
essentially the crux of Al Ghazali's
Exactly.
philosophical rebuttal to this thing. Now, that's one of the major heresies that Al Ghazali identifies. The second one being that God does not know particulars.
Yeah, this one I
Now-
find to be kind of. I don't like this one.
Yeah. So maybe we didn't cover this earlier. I don't think we did.
Yeah.
But in Ibn Sina's cosmology, the necessary being does not know particulars. He only knows himself. And because of only knowing himself, he can only contemplate himself. And out of contemplating himself, then the intellects flow and then he can understand universals. So God essentially only understands universals. He does not understand particulars, is what the philosopher's position
So that's
is.
just to clarify, because I think people often misunderstand this. There is a level of charity we must afford Ibn Sina here.
Yeah.
His argument is like, think of it like a mandala structure.
Yeah.
For a second.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the reason why God cannot know particulars essentially boils down to the fact that in Ibn Sina's cosmology, right, God is unchanging. God's information is always perfect. God is single unitary. If God knows particulars, that unity is compromised. Why?
It implies a change in
because
him.
particulars, the material world is subject to flux, becoming. We're coming all the way back to becoming, right? So the material world's existence isn't becoming, it's changing. And because it's changing, God cannot know of it. Why? Because
It would-
God's
it would
knowledge,
change his knowing.
It would change his knowing. And if it would change his knowing, if God's knowledge was subject to changes, then it is contingent
It
upon
corrupts
those
the
changing.
simplicity
It
as well.
com-
Yeah.
It corrupts the simplicity, and then you get the contingency problem within God. So that is Ibn Sina's very, very elaborate, sophisticated argument as to why God cannot know particulars. Yeah.
Man, that and then, but how does God know the universe?
Yeah.
Ibn Sina argues that there is a way in which God knows about everything, but it's not the way in which we know about everything.
Yeah.
So, for example, because essentially all things are caused by the first cause, and he has knowledge of what he has caused, he will have knowledge of what those things continue to cause and so on, right?
Yeah.
So in that particular sense, God knows of the entirety of the universe, but he does not. But at the same time, that eternal
He understands
omnipotent
Plato's
being,
ideal forms. He
Yeah.
understands the forms
yeah,
of them, the
but
universal concepts
apparently,
of those things.
But apparently, that God is not able to understand or know when a leaf is falling in the universe.
Yes.
Which again, like to
And
me, is preposterous.
Yeah, and
but
so Al Ghazali's theological rebuttal to this is simply that a God who does not know particulars is not the God of Islam, because
yeah.
literally the God of Islam answers your prayers. He communicates with you.
Yeah.
He sends down prophets for specific mission. So he's very, very much involved in the particulars.
Bro, the entire revelation of the Quran is in dialogue with the Prophet, peace be upon him's life.
Yeah.
Okay? When he is in despair, it is sent to console him.
Yeah.
When he has achieved great victory, it participates or validates in his exhilaration.
Yeah.
Right? It isn't, and that's why he is the conduit to our religion, to the way we live our lives, right? So that very direct, and it is then, because then the Ummah takes on the mantle of not revelation, of course, but of carrying Islam forward. We are then when we read the Quran, in indirect, or I don't know whether you'd say direct or indirect, I don't want to say anything inappropriate, but you're in dialogue with God himself, because he is speaking to you, O believer, even to non-believers, O non-believer, O mankind.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, and I'm sure...
It's deeply theologically
Yeah.
problematic,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
And the philosophical and I would say to some degree psychological rebuttal that...
Oh, just to
Al
say
Ghazali-
that this is also the root of, and we won't get into it, or I won't get into it because it'll get too long, but this is probably also the root of the Quran created uncreatedness debate, which
Yeah.
is like...
Yeah, that too. But coming back to the philosophical rebuttal that Al Ghazali says, and psychological rebuttal that Al Ghazali gives to the philosophers, and particularly Ibn Sina, for this is precisely this. What he says is that you are projecting the limits of your knowledge onto
Yeah.
a being who is ontologically different to you. He does not know the way you know because he's ontologically different. So you're projecting your own limitations on God, essentially. Which
You're
is like,
projecting, bro.
You're literally
Literally.
projecting your limitations
Yeah.
on God, you know? So it's a very, very succinct jawab. And it's kind of tough to argue against.
It is. It
Yeah.
is.
And then the third heresy, as you mentioned earlier, is bodily resurrection.
Yeah.
The philosophers argue that resurrection is a symbolic, it's allegorical, it's not meant to be taken literal.
It's or rather the objection there is Ibn Sina says the soul is eternal.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's in that way, yes, there is an afterlife.
Yeah.
But the body will not be reconstructed.
Yes.
Whereas in the Quran it says he can reconstruct the very tips of your fingers.
Yeah.
Okay. That I understand. There's if you're very rational minded,
Yeah.
there is this impetus to take everything in a metaphorical or allegorical sense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get more literal than that.
Yes, yes.
Right?
And what Al Ghazali essentially says is that, bro, this is an extremely slippery slope. Just if you can allegorize away bodily resurrection, you can allegorize away everything.
yeah.
And that's an extremely slippery slope that we don't want to get down on.
The
And
day of judgment becomes something vastly different in a corporeal sense
Yeah.
if you reject bodily resurrection and you say that on the one hand the Quran is telling you, it explicitly says that you doubt, or I'm paraphrasing, but you doubt that we can resurrect you on the day of judgment. Nay, we can reconstruct the very tips of your fingers,
Yeah.
right? And he's saying that no, there will be so much wasted matter that it will be difficult for that God who does not know particulars to put you together again.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, and then,
So there is a point, like, again,
yeah,
all respect due to Ibn Sina for his intellectual effort.
Yeah.
And we really try our best to be intellectually charitable as possible on the burger shop.
Yeah.
But there is a certain point where, in my eyes, there's open contradiction.
Yeah, yeah, and like Al Ghazali also takes it further than this, where he says that okay, the philosophical rebuttal to something like this is that God will not resurrect matter because God does not deal in particulars. And then Al Ghazali is essentially like, yeah, I don't accept that blasphemous and philosophically bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt position anyways, so I'm just going to ignore it. So that's kind of his reply to it. He's like, bro, even what you would argue, you have no good argument against why God could not do bodily resurrection other than the fact that you think that God does not deal in particulars and does not deal in the material world. But I reject that altogether.
Yeah.
So, case closed.
Yeah.
So that's essentially Al Ghazali putting that entire
Yeah.
Ibn Sina's framework to sword in a lot of ways. I still think that there is, some cool stuff you can come out with Ibn Sina's work. The contingency necessary being stuff is...
Yeah, absolutely.
I think absolutely.
It's a great argument for God.
It's a great argument for God, and it does make sense, and it's I don't think there's anything really, really heretical about it. It's like, it's a justification. It's one of many justifications for God's existence.
I mean, the only thing, I'll add this as a caveat just so that we're not misunderstood, is that the unitary simplicity of the being,
Yeah, and the contingency itself.
and the which exists because of the metaphysical limits imposed upon it, is kind of inherent to his argument for God as well, right? But just as a pure anti-regression argument, it still works. So there is a part of that argument you can make without the heretical part of it.
Yeah.
In my eyes.
Yes, essentially. So that's kind of what Al Ghazali does with the philosophers. For better or for worse, here we are for better. That stuff, the system of open symbols was put to a halt, and
Al Ghazali's tough, bro.
Al Ghazali's tough.
Yeah.